Hey guys, hope you're well. We're gonna finish up this series we're doing on unity. And so if you've been following along, really in the month of September, you've seen that each week we've sort of talked about Ephesians 4, specifically verses 1 through 3, and how Paul's words to the church at Ephesus ultimately are pressing us to come together and to unite, and what that means for the church then, and what that means for the church now, how we as believers should be driven toward each other, not apart from each other. C.S. Lewis says that one of the hardest things, he says this in his book Mere Christianity, that one of the worst things about the Christian community sometimes is that they're like ships colliding against each other, or they're like ships drawing away from each other, that they don't often work together like in unity, in proper formation to achieve the task at hand, which would ultimately be the glory of God. And so what I want to finish with today, previously we talked specifically about how Paul wants us to walk in a manner worthy of the gospel, and how that drives us to unity, how we're to walk with humility and gentleness. And then last week we talked about what it means to sort of endure or bear with one another. And this week, I want to hammer home one thought. This should be real short, and it's just the idea that the Lord wants from us just to maintain unity through a bond of peace. So He just wants us to be the types of people that are constantly working to maintain unity, to maintain the bond that draws us together towards the gospel, and to be constantly working towards that end. Matthew 7, when Jesus is preaching from the Sermon on the Mount, one of his thoughts is, he said, "Blessed be the peacemakers, right? For they will inherit the kingdom of heaven." And so for us, that means as believers, if you're a believer listening to this, how most of our actions need to be thought about, like, how can I be driving people toward each other? How can I be creating unity? What can I be doing to help maintain unity in the church, in my community, in my school, in my workplace? What can I be doing to drive people toward each other, not working to divide people? And so I want to read out of Ephesians 4 just to kind of reiterate Paul's words here. He says, "I, therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain," listen to this, "eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." Notice there's two things that are important. One, Paul tells us that it is our job, our eagerness should be toward maintaining the unity, right, of the Spirit. What that doesn't give us the responsibility is creating unity. That is not, like, the Lord creates the unity of the Spirit. The Lord creates this central idea that we are driven towards. And that's the idea that Christ died for us, right? He saw us in our wickedness. He came to earth. He lived a life. He died for us and rose from the dead that we might be saved through faith in Him. That He created. It is not our job to create unity, but to maintain it by the unity He's already created in Christ. And so my job as a Christian is to maintain unity. And in doing so, just before I really dig into this, in doing so, I think we're going to present a message of the gospel to the world that they'll be drawn to it too, right? So when the world sees Christians driving people together, when the world sees Christians not being divisive, when the world sees Christians being effective members of hope and of good and of the things that ultimately the world desires for its communities and for its wherever the context it's in, when it sees Christians driving people to good and together, right? That's an attractive idea. That's something that people will be attracted to, especially like in our current context where it seems like all we're doing is dividing each other right now. We're highlighting each other's differences as a reason to run from each other rather than to run to each other. And so I would say both is true, that if you're a Christian, your job is to maintain the unity, not create it, but that works for both believers, right? Because we as believers should be drawing to each other, but it also works to show a message or a testimony of the gospel to non-believers, that they might see that we're doing a good job. And oftentimes, if we're just being really blunt, the church and Christians don't necessarily do a good job with that. And I think that's why Paul's calling out the church at Ephesus here, is that, hey, they're doing a lot of things right. One of the things he wants to see happen at the church at Ephesus and the church at Corinth and the church at Rome, and his specific things that he says in their letters, is he wants to see them drive together, to not let their differences separate them, but to maintain this unity of peace. And in the pagan sort of Roman world of this time that he's writing, these attributes that he's calling them to would have been seen as weak, right? Things like humility, gentleness, patience, love. Right? Those are all attributes we find in Christ, which led him to death on the cross. For a pagan Roman world, those are all attributes that they would have seen as weakness. They would have highlighted power and pride and strength and things like that, and not seen humility, gentleness, peace as attributes to be desired. I don't know that is all that untrue of us today. Sorry, that was a mosquito. Speaking of divisive, I don't know that that's all that untrue of us today. Do we not see that? Man, what do we define strength as? Like, what do we define? People that we define as strong aren't generally given the words of humble or gentle or patient. We generally see those people as sort of loud and boisterous and powerful and prideful. And so I would say that we're not all that undifferent from the people at Rome the people at Ephesus that he's writing to here. So these attributes would have been something that would have been a little unnatural for his context in Ephesus, and still feels a little unnatural for us today. But those attributes, humility, gentleness, patience, right, unity, that's what the Lord calls us to. And yeah, it is going to look a little different than the world around us. I don't know if you've noticed, like, the world around us doesn't filled with those things. Like, we will look different from the world, but those are the things, humility, gentleness, patience, right, peace, that drives people together. How do we maintain, like, the big question is how do I as a believer maintain the unity of the Spirit? Man, with all humility and with gentleness and with patience and with peace, right? This peace is a state of reconciliation and love that acts as a bond to join believers together. Right? How do I demonstrate that? How do I make that happen in my context, in my family, in my church, right, in my community? Man, I walk in humility. I walk in gentleness. I walk in patience, so that the people around me see that what the gospel does in a man's heart and a woman's heart is drive people to each other. This message can't be overheard right now. And if the gospel is really alive in the church, it's really alive in believers, it should be driving people to each other by the way we walk in humility, gentleness, patience, and peace. And so I guess, I know this seems short, but my one thought that I want y'all to walk away from this entire 4-part series is that if we're walking out our faith, if we're Christians growing in holiness, then some of these attributes are going to show up in our lives in an effort to drive people toward each other, toward the gospel. Man, if the gospel's alive and well in your life, if it's in your heart, man, it should show up as gentleness and humility and patience. And trust me, I'm as much preaching to me as I am to you right now that, man, I need to walk more in humility. I need to walk more in gentleness. I need to walk more in patience. I need to bear with one another more in love in order to maintain the unity of the Spirit, in order to drive people together, in order to drive people to the gospel. I need to do that more so that Christ is made much of and God is glorified in this world, because that message, the message that Christ saves, that Christ unites, is the message the world needs right now. It's not that we need more education. It's not that we need to get rid of certain aspects of our society. It's that, man, sin is running rampant in our world and it needs Jesus to kill it. And so my hope in you guys just really focusing on Ephesians 4, 1 through 3, is that you would see that, the responsibility of unity isn't on you. Christ has done that work already. Right? The responsibility is on you as believers to maintain the unity that he's already done, and that will ultimately look like walking in humility and gentleness and endurance and forbearance and patience and peace. And I hope that Paul encourages you in these words to do that better, so that we can walk in a manner worthy of the calling that's on our heart. The calling on our hearts is to walk as these men and women that make much of Jesus, right? So that people see him better, see him clear, hear him from our mouths better and clear, and are driven to him, and they're saved to the glory of God. Love you guys. Talk to you soon.